So this is the second of 5 videos I'm doing into the Devil May Cry series as a whole, and once again I'm looking at comparing each game to the other games in the series about how they change and how they don't, and how the tone of Devil May Cry as a series is very inconsistent from gameplay to plot to style and etc. And because this is the second video in the series, I'm actually able to talk in reference to other Devil May Cry games. In this case, the first one that I've already done a video on, which you can see right here. So, Devil May Cry 2. Perhaps the most diversive Devil May Cry game, although perhaps not, simply because most people seem to hate it. With good reason, given the rest of the history of games that will come after this video. It's clear to see that Devil May Cry 2 is perhaps the least Devil May Cry game of the bunch. Now, that's not to say all the mechanics of other Devil May Cry games switch it up a lot more, because some of them do. However, Devil May Cry is intrinsically not a Devil May Cry game. Now, let's just talk about the development of the game to start off with, because this game wasn't actually developed by Hideki Kamiya, the developer of Devil May Cry 1. He himself has actually expressed his disappointment that he was never actually allowed to continue the series, and chances are if he did, we probably would have ended up with a different kind of Devil May Cry game for Devil May Cry 2. There's also various rules of the Devil May Cry series universe when it comes to making these games that I think Devil May Cry 2 doesn't actually follow. Now, for the second game in the series, these aren't rules that are set in stone, but they're current themes and trending plots that work across the games that I believe make for a Devil May Cry series game. And Devil May Cry 2 ultimately just doesn't have these things. Now, it wasn't just a different director that made Devil May Cry 2, it was a completely different team. Capcom Production Studio 1 made Devil May Cry 2, whereas Capcom Production Studio 4 made Devil May Cry 1, and as such, the development was based on fixing things that apparently were problems in Devil May Cry 1, expanding it to try and make it bigger. Most notably, of course, is the moving away, or at least toning down, of puzzles in Devil May Cry 2 compared to what there are in 1, and making the world a lot bigger as well. The environments in Devil May Cry 2 are huge. Now, that's not to say they lack detail, although it often has the look of lacking detail, simply because you never really get close enough to anywhere that really shows off the detail that's actually in the game and the environment. But gameplay wise, most of the environments are pretty big and therefore don't really allow much in the way of diversity to them. There's no big confined spaces that cause you to have to really work your gameplay around to really challenge the player. It's big open areas with monsters throwing at you, and you're always able to get a great view on what's going on in the action. That's a plus, but without the detail that perhaps the Resident Evil aspects led into the development of Devil May Cry 1 for, it meant that what we ended up with was a very, very different experience for Devil May Cry 2 than what the first one had. Now, story-wise, in the actual Devil May Cry series timeline, Devil May Cry 2 is the very last one, at least currently it is anyway. Now, the plot is also fairly simple compared to the other games in this series as well. It really focuses on one thing for the most part, trying to stop an evil businessman from gaining all power and trying to destroy the world. It's even more toned down and simple and B-movie-ish than really what the first Devil May Cry was. However, this is told in 2 different ways, which is kind of interesting. Now, we have 2 playable characters in this game. We have Dante and Lucille. They have their own stories, but for the most part, it really feels like it's trying to pull off a kind of Resident Evil 2 kind of thing as well, to the first Devil May Cry's RE1 kind of thing. We have 2 different characters who are constantly running into each other. However, there's a few things that really go wrong with this. Now, for the most part, Dante has changed as a character from this game, but we'll talk about him later. What has changed overall is the tone of the game, and this is something that I believe is reflected against all Devil May Cry games. Every Devil May Cry game, except for Devil May Cry 2, is all about Dante's family, or the Spada family as a rule. Dante, Virgil, Nero, etc. None of this family plot made it into Devil May Cry 2, there's just no need for it. Dante is the only member of his family to appear, and really get referenced as well from what I can see. And it's a bit of a shame is this, because the underlying family problems of the Devil May Cry characters is really what the main stories are always about, no matter what's going on with the rest of the game and who the villains are. And it's a shame that this kind of thing just isn't there. However, there are some actual interesting story elements, especially with Lucia, who really doesn't perhaps get the recognition she deserves for her actual character. Now, gameplay aside, they do stuff with Lucia that they couldn't actually do with Dante because of who he is. While he has a character change, he couldn't undergo the kind of experiences that Lucia gets from finding out that she was actually a developed person. She was actually made and created by our main villain of the game, and it's something that perhaps is a bit downplayed in the grand scheme of things, but it's interesting and something that no other character in the Devil May Cry universe has actually had to deal with. So really, there are only 4 actual characters in the game. Dante and Lucia obviously are the main 2 playable characters. Dante's lost his main attitude from the first game. He's obviously a lot older in this game anyway, but in this game he acts, well, more like an arsehole really. He constantly flips a coin to decide if he wants to help or not. Now ultimately this is a ruse to make him appear more arrogant and aloof than he actually is, because the coin is two-headed, and therefore the odds of him doing what he wants to do are always in his favour, which means he can make it feel like chance is actually making him go and face a boss instead of Lucia, when it's actually him just trying to be the hero without anyone knowing he's the hero. It's a weird tonal change for the character, and something that I don't like, and it would appear that most of the fans actually agree with me here. He's also got a new look as well, when he switched in lots of black and red for his character change. It's not a bad look, but it really feels completely different to what he was before. Again, it makes him look like a little bit older, a little bit more emo, and I don't think as a rule most people really like this look for him. Lucia, on the other hand, is a much lighter character with bright red hair, and she's someone who really kind of leaps out a bit more, and as a character herself, she actually has a lot going on for her. Her story deals with how she actually finds out that she's an experiment of our series' Big Bad Arius, and she actually finds she's an experiment created by the game's Big Bad Arius, and it leads to actually a lot happening with her character, and perhaps she is the more interesting character in this game. I've read conflicting reports that this game was actually in development and Dante was added into it to make it into a Devil May Cry game. Now, I don't have any surefire evidence for this because I've seen stuff that says either or for it, but it's an interesting idea, and it actually makes me think that a game like this with Lucia as the primary character would have actually done quite well on its own. It didn't necessarily need the presence of Dante, and given how the game's ultimately turned out, it's not much of a Devil May Cry game anyway. Perhaps as its own game or IP, it would have done something interesting, perhaps in the same way that Lightning Returns does that as well. Ultimately, of the 2 main playable characters, obviously Trish is also included in the game as well, with Dante's Devil May Cry 1 moveset, but we'll talk about that later as well. Arius is the only other main character, and he's the big bad of the game. He's an evil businessman, and really, that's as stupid as it sounds. He's pretty much a toned down, if not budget, Hihashi Mishima from Tekken. He's got the look, he's got the sneer, and he really just reeks of being evil collector, wants power, will kill anything that stands in his way. It's so unbelievably cliched that it adds nothing to the game in itself, in my opinion at least. Ultimately, however, whether you like the looks of the characters or not, their character models, as well as the actual look of the entire game, is so much more improved from what it was in Devil May Cry 1. There's a lot more detail packed into everything, and the cheapness of the motion capture and some of the special effects or the VFX laid onto the models, especially things like Trish's lightning and, well, any lightning that was done in Devil May Cry 1 looks a lot better in this. It's tonally a lot stronger with how it actually represents its visual look. It's a shame that there's less detail in the worlds as itself, but there's certainly an evolution here of how Capcom was working with the PS2, and that's probably because a much more experienced production team really got the chance to make a Devil May Cry game, and it's something that at very least helps with actually giving time to the other team to really rack up their credits on PS2 games for making the future games in the series look amazing. So let's talk about the enemies in this game, because aside from Arius, our main enemies in the game aren't quite of the level of style that we got in the first Devil May Cry. Whereas we had the great marionettes in Devil May Cry 1, in Devil May Cry 2, our major basic enemy is more like an Iron Maiden, a living torture casket come to life, and for somehow it doesn't just quite seem as menacing as smacking around giant iron frames in the scenery. And also, even more than that, there are some really stupid enemies in this game, especially the bosses. While we had big hulking bosses, giant spiders, griffins and blobs in the first game, for some reason we have demonic copters and tanks and stuff that is just Well, it's weird, it doesn't totally fit in the Devil May Cry universe, but the idea of having a demonic tank as a boss doesn't really speak of something that has much strategy or look to it as well. When you're just going up and laying into a tank from whatever side you can get into, it's stupid, really. I don't really have any other words to describe it. I don't like it, and while I believe there are probably a few people who do like this idea of demonic living day technology coming to life and attacking you, I don't even think it fits within the whole idea of Arius himself. Well, yes, he is a technically minded villain, and I guess experimenting with both demons and current day tech is a thing that he would do. I find the idea of bringing things to life mechanically and attacking something that's a bit strange. While it does feel tonally inconsistent, I guess, within the scheme of the game itself, with everything being inanimate objects brought to life, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just weird, I guess, and it means there's a lack of fun to the game in itself. I feel like the design of enemies just don't echo the kind of macabre atmosphere that Devil May Cry 1 had, and that's a really big letdown for everything as a whole. I feel like having that great diversity of enemies, as well as having enemies that are brought in from both mythological and other kind of fantasy-based trends mixed with horror aspects, was something that made Devil May Cry 1 great, and again more links to its Resident Evil horror roots. Whereas Devil May Cry 2 just doesn't really have any of that, and I feel like it loses a little bit of its charm by not having that. Of course, in moving out from its original Devil May Cry 1 / Resident Evil tones as well, the world of Devil May Cry 2 is completely different. Gone is the big, small, detailed castle and grounds that you explore from the first game, whereas in Devil May Cry 2 you're opened up into big towns and buildings. Again, it's not to say they're not nice, it's just not in keeping to have so much space and variation. Enemies come and you'll never really felt like you're in corridors and you have to cleverly or skillfully avoid them if you don't want to fight. You can run around them, and run around them by massive arcs as well. Only when your progress isn't hindered are you really forced to go around and fighting them, and because the world is so big, sometimes that can involve just scrolling around the map until you actually find the things as well. It's not particularly nice, although some of the landscapes of the game do work as some nice little areas. There's a great cityscape bit, and while I think there's perhaps too much of an emphasis put on the big man-made landscapes for the majority of the game, you do get some nice variations from big towering cityscapes to smaller, more rural like towns, where it seems like they've taken a lot of inspiration for making from Spanish culture, and these kind of towns and buildings would work in a much more condensed environment, and it's something that I think future games actually do pull off a lot better. Ultimately, however, unlike Devil May Cry 1, Devil May Cry 2 doesn't spend enough in the purely demonic kinds of landscapes and environments they can make. The Abyss is something that's not really encountered until the very end of the game, and just not enough is seen of it. I feel like this is the time when they can really jump off the rails and do something crazy, and it really will be a while until Devil May Cry really hits that doing something crazy. But for now, I guess it just feels like the world and landscape of Devil May Cry 2 is a bit missed potential, which is unfortunate, but what we've got is at least pretty and does lay some groundwork for things to come. Now, I don't think DmC2 has a complete lack of originality when it comes to its environments. Well, it does go through its lovely little Spanish town settings, and it goes up into a much more mechanical, futuristic, or at least modern day sci-fi-ish look for its environments later on in the game. I do happen to think that while the areas look individual and unique from a Devil May Cry standard, because nothing else has really been done like it in the series, I have to contrast that with, again, it seeming like the progress of another Resident Evil game being used to influence Devil May Cry 2. Now, I'm not sure at what point we get to stop saying this was inspired by Resident Evil, because this is a completely different team, and I don't know for sure if they were actually aiming to be copying the ideas from Resident Evil, but again, because that's kind of a horror movie staple in the first place anyway, it doesn't necessarily mean Resident Evil was the inspiration for this kind of stuff. However, I believe it's a perfectly valid thing to say that once again, this feels like retreading Resident Evil in lieu of actually coming up with something original. This goes one step further for the more demonic areas you find later on in the game that, again, feel somewhat cheaply made because they're just reusing the environments already made from earlier in the game and adding a lot more filters and effects to make them seem more demonic, and it doesn't really have the originality to it that the original Devil May Cry had. And on top of that as well, they're already reusing every environment in the game anyway when it comes to Lucy and her second campaign, which is contrast to Dante's. There's a lot of laziness that really just goes on here. Now, I never talked about the audio in the first Devil May Cry game, and I probably should have. It mixes the horror aspects of the game scenery with some really action rock heavy music that really defines Devil May Cry. It's fast and action based, and it's something that really does do the game great justice. Devil May Cry 2 isn't quite as good. I don't know why, it just feels like the quality of the music doesn't quite match it. There's nothing really in the soundtrack that strikes me as memorable, and to this day, there's nothing really that brings me any emotion like every other Devil May Cry game actually does, with Devil May Cry 1 with its opening haunting track with Spider's history being explained, or the Devil May Cry theme from Devil May Cry 3, or the brilliant use of Napella Monday in the more recent DmC reboot. Audio wise, it's just not as good, and I feel like the soundtrack to Devil May Cry 2, while not bad, just suffers through not having a few really key standout pieces that really elevate the game to being memorable for certain set pieces, and it's a shame, because most of the biggest set pieces in the game just have generic rock with the actual sound effects of things like guns really eclipsing them. It's in contrast to the first game actually, where it was actually the background music that often eclipsed what the characters were saying. That was a bit of a flaw with the first game, and something that I probably should have mentioned then. But Devil May Cry 2 just does it in reverse by not bringing music to the forefront enough, and it's another key piece of identity that the Devil May Cry series generally has that Devil May Cry 2 just doesn't. Obviously, you can't talk about the sound of Devil May Cry 2 without talking about the sound effects of Devil May Cry 2, and that is probably one of the worst and mundane things about the game. Constantly hearing the same grunts over and over again from both characters, and those grunts not even sounding crisp and clear, but really low budget audio quality as well. The sound effects themselves don't really help that much either, they just sound so toned down compared to the original game. They could be the same sound effects, at least for the swords hitting, but Dante's voice obviously is completely different and everyone else is a new cast member. I don't like the sound effects, and they become grating because of the same things being heard over and over again, and especially the gun sounds and that chip 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 sound that you get over and over again through Lucille's daggers that she seems to have an infinite amount of. Dante has devil weapons that he's created himself, and yet I don't really want to question the whole idea of ammo in the Devil May Cry universe. It's one complete area of craziness that is, well, completely insane when you think about it, but the whole use of sound effects in the game is just grating to a real fault, and it really doesn't help with the monotony of the game as you're going through, and those sounds just get caught in your head over and over again. But as of yet, I've still not really discussed the gameplay of Devil May Cry 2. Now a lot has changed in Devil May Cry 2, and it's really the biggest thing that makes it not feel like a Devil May Cry game. The actual mechanics of the gameplay are perhaps the biggest change. The combat. You see, while Devil May Cry 1 relied on timing of its attacks to get the variation you need when you weren't using the easy automatic mode, combat in Devil May Cry 2 is actually done differently. It's actually based on the direction of the analog stick that the kinds of attacks you get, as opposed to the timing in the actual attack itself. Now, a slight crux to this is actually Trish, when you unlock her, actually controls like the Devil May Cry 1 counterpart of Dante. But as a whole, I'm not actually down with the combat changes. It makes the game a lot easier as a whole to get that kind of diversity, and the game itself isn't really that much taxing compared to the first Devil May Cry game anyway. Devil May Cry 2 is seen as being a lot easier as a whole, and as such there's no need for an easy difficulty anyway. A few more things have actually been added though to do with the environment. Now there is a free run and evade button that allows you to run up scenery or dodge around enemies, and it's something that could be done without its own dedicated button in Devil May Cry 1. But they wanted to add a few free running aspects, and it's something that does kind of continue into the future games, so it's not the worst thing. I just feel like it could have been somehow tacked on, or at least tied into the combat even more than what it is. Obviously the fixed camera angles of Devil May Cry 1 still appear here as well to an extent, but with the camera being pulled back so much, it's not really as big an issue, and it's not so fixed as so much as it is scrolling. Ultimately, the camera isn't a big issue in this game like it was the first game, because it never gets up close and personal, and there's all sorts of problems with that I've already gone into with the amount of detail you actually see. Strangely enough, there's actually 2 levels of Devil Trigger in this game as well. You have your standard Devil Trigger, but you also have a special Devil Trigger that works on top of that when you get low in health. It's ultimately something that's not needed, and just makes the game one step easier by giving you another little Hail Mary should you even get to the point where you're low in health in this game. Now, One thing I do want to talk about, not so much with the gameplay, is the actual animations. Now, Devil May Cry 1 had a lot of motion capture going on, but it never really pushed into some more crazy and extreme animations. Devil May Cry 2 is a little bit different, and one of the biggest things you'll notice is how much smoother the animations are, but also how strange some of them are as well. Dante in particular, when knocked to the ground, sometimes will start rolling on the floor and that roll will magically spring him into the air. We're talking Matrix levels of gravity defying stuff here, and well, Dante's always been a bit of aloof and somewhat indestructible through most of the game. Gravity defying is something that I've never seen him, and it strikes as something else to try and make him look cool and fit in with current trends. Yet, it just feels slightly out of place here, as well as having animations that really have big wind-ups when it comes to recovery. It's slightly strange, and you'll probably just notice the difference here and there. Ultimately though, it's an up in quality from the first game just because there's so much more detail put into the animation. Whether it's a bad thing or not, I guess is based on the user, but for me it's heavily noticeable and something that I feel like actually makes it lose a bit of a pace, having such smooth animation, coupled with having such smooth animation as opposed to fast instant animation. It's something that we're probably going to have to come back to later on when we talk about DmC, but for now I don't think it ultimately affects this game too much because the difficulty isn't there to really back it up. If you're losing a few frames here on how much your reaction time gets from animation to animation or what you're able to cancel out of, it doesn't matter too much when the penalties for getting caught every now and then by an attack don't really matter too much. The style gauge is definitely present from the first game, but it doesn't really matter because for some reason knockback in this game has been amped up to incredible levels that it makes it really hard to get a high level of style anyway. In the first game there was very little you could do to actually knock back the enemies you were facing. Really you'd have to use something like the shotgun or a more powerful weapon to make sure you really knocked the enemies back when you needed to, but even then they more fall back on the floor than they would actually out of range. In Devil May Cry 2 you can knock characters far across the environment, which is great until it comes to following up that combination and trying to continue to increase your style gauge. If you knock them out of range, there's no way for you to get back across the room and follow up to them. Another annoying thing as well is the actual weapons in the game. Now unlike Devil May Cry 1 and every other Devil May Cry game, you're going to find that getting another weapon just gives you more power, but it doesn't give you new animations or change the way you play the game. Dante and Lucia are actual very different characters in how they play, but ultimately there's no more animations on top of what they do, and you can't get animations for various style gameplay. You have one way to play each character and you have to work with that. You don't have the influx of flexibility that the multiple weapons of the first game gives you, and it's something that I think makes an ultimate detriment to the experience you get in the gameplay of Devil May Cry 2. Now, I don't think I'm really being fair when I say that the weapons really don't have any variety to them. There is some. Some of the swords you get from Some of the swords you get do actually give you a new set of animations, although they don't really change how you can implement them, and you can't switch between them on the fly that you can in future games. It's really just giving you a new combo to match the size of the weapon that you had before. It's all about the sizes. If Dante's got a more Cloud Buster sword like size weapon, he'll have a suitable combo and animations to match, but the game doesn't actually feel like it changes anymore, and really that's about the only difference. Obviously guns work in the same way that they have their own firing styles and rates, and that's one of the few things that does feel the same from Devil May Cry 1 to Devil May Cry 2. So ultimately, what does Devil May Cry give us? Well, difficulty wise it's not nearly on the level as it was Devil May Cry 1. While there are certainly extras you get for completing the game and more difficulties on top, you're not really challenged as much. You can unlock Trish as an extra bonus as well, who is basically Devil May Cry 1 Dante. It's something that just makes you think that Devil May Cry 2 would have been more better if it was like Devil May Cry 1. Another little weird but extra you can get in the game as well is diesel costumes for the characters. Now for some reason Capcom got licenses for the characters to have diesel jeans and other clothing. It's really one of the weirder tie-ins I've seen, and I can't say I've seen anything else like it since. I don't even think it fits within the idea of the Devil May Cry games, and it's something that I'm hoping just gets forgotten over time as a silly little marketing ploy that they tried and ultimately was deemed stupid. The ultimate legacy of Devil May Cry 2 I think goes down as it being the worst Devil May Cry game. Mostly because it's bland for most of the time, but it follows its own formula that doesn't in-keep with the actual Devil May Cry formula the series will go on to have. The sequel will ultimately change things by going back to the basics and going back to before the first Devil May Cry game as well, and it makes it so much better. There's a lot to the lore of the Devil May Cry series that really wasn't invented for number 1 and therefore wasn't continued into Devil May Cry 2. But moving into Devil May Cry 3, or moving back for Devil May Cry 3, depending on how you want to look at it, is something that really, for the first time, gives the game and its lore and its world a chance to shine. It gives them a chance to world build and set up the future games, and this is why Devil May Cry 2 has ultimately been left as the furthest from all the other games, timeline-wise. Everything else becomes much more of a conjoined series, and Devil May Cry 2 is just unfortunately the bad uncle of the series that you kind of have to deal with being there, but no one really wants to accept or include in the series as a whole. It's what it is, ultimately, and worth a play if you want to see what they did for Devil May Cry 2, and there's also a few things here that do actually make it into future Devil May Cry games, so the ultimate legacy that it has on the rest of the series isn't completely stripped out, but it's pretty much toned down. You have to look for these elements in future games. But that's Devil May Cry 2. A letdown, perhaps, but if anything, it sold well when it got us to Devil May Cry 3, and this is where things really start to amp up for the series, which, as you'll soon see, makes Devil May Cry 3 one of the most enjoyable games to both play and experience you're going to see in a long time. And I hope you'll join me for that next time as well.
Please, deal with Arius and his master for us.
Looks like it's your lucky day.